Rosa Martinez had perfected the art of being invisible. At 50, she'd been cleaning the gleaming corridors of Valente Technologies for nearly 2 decades, her navy blue uniform as much a part of the building's landscape as the marble floors she polished each morning. She arrived at 5 a.m. sharp, her cart rattling softly through empty hallways while the city still slept outside the towering glass walls. Most employees barely registered her presence. She was just Rosa, the quiet janitor with the warm smile who, somehow, always knew exactly where the coffee stains would appear and which executive would leave their takeout containers scattered across their desk. They saw her uniform, her mop, her practiced efficiency, but they never really saw her. That suited Rosa just fine. She had her reasons for staying in the shadows. This particular Tuesday morning felt different, though. As Rosa pushed her cart toward the executive floor, she noticed an unusual tension crackling through the air. Employees huddled in tight clusters, their voices hushed but urgent. The energy reminded her of a storm brewing, all pressure and electricity, with nowhere to go. "The whole system's down," she heard someone whisper near the elevators. "Right in the middle of the biggest investor call of the year." Rosa paused, pretending to organize her cleaning supplies while she listened. Through 20 years of invisible observation, she'd learned that corporate crises often revealed more about people than their successes ever could. "Mr. Davidson is losing his mind up there," another voice added. "The IT guys have been working on it for an hour, and they're completely stumped." Mr. Davidson, the CEO whose corner office Rosa cleaned every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m. She knew his habits better than his own secretary, how he took his coffee, black, no sugar, how he organized his desk, 3 neat piles, always, and how he paced when he was stressed, exactly 7 steps between his desk and the window. As Rosa made her way to the 27th floor, the tension became almost unbearable. Expensive suits rushed past her without acknowledgement, their faces pale with panic. The IT department's entire team had gathered in the main conference room. Laptops and cables spread across the polished table like the remnants of a digital battlefield. Rosa glimpsed the chaos through the glass doors as she worked. Men in crisp shirts and designer watches hunched over screens, their fingers flying across keyboards with increasing desperation. She recognized the look, the same expression she'd worn years ago when debugging seemed impossible, when the solution danced just beyond reach. Years ago. Before life had swept her dreams away like debris after a hurricane. She pushed the memory aside and continued her rounds, but something nagged at her. As she emptied trash cans and wiped down surfaces, her mind couldn't help but drift to the snippets of technical conversation bleeding through conference room walls. Complete system lockout. Encrypted beyond recognition. Like, "It's fighting back?" Rosa's hands stilled on her cleaning cloth. Those weren't the words of a simple crash. They were describing something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous. By 7 a.m., the panic had reached fever pitch. Rosa watched from the break room doorway as Mark Chen, Mr. Davidson's young assistant, paced frantically outside the CEO's office. Mark was one of the few people in the building who actually knew her name, who wished her good morning and asked about her weekend plans. His obvious distress tugged at something protective in Rosa's chest. Through the glass walls of Mr. Davidson's office, she could see the CEO himself, red-faced, gesticulating wildly as he barked orders into his phone. The massive display screen that typically showed the company's real-time metrics flickered with error messages instead of the steady green numbers that represented millions in revenue. "We're about to lose everything," she heard him shout, his voice carrying despite the closed door. "Fix this now, or heads will roll." The IT specialists huddled deeper over their equipment, but Rosa could see the defeat creeping into their postures. Their confident morning energy had evaporated, replaced by the grim realization that they were out of their depth. Rosa had seen this before, though not in corporate boardrooms. She'd seen it in her tiny apartment, hunched over second-hand computers. She'd rescued from dumpsters, teaching herself programming languages by lamplight while her infant son slept in the next room. She'd seen it in the reflection of her laptop screen during those long nights when dreams seemed impossible, but the logic of code made perfect sense. She'd been good at it once. More than good. Brilliant, according to her professors. But life had other plans. Single motherhood, financial desperation, and a world that seemed determined to keep women like her in the margins had slowly buried that version of herself beneath years of practical survival. Still, Rosa had never completely let go. In the quiet hours after her son went to bed, she still tinkered with old machines, still felt the familiar thrill of solving digital puzzles. It was her secret rebellion against a world that had decided she was only ever meant to clean up after other people's messes. Now, watching the panic unfold around her, Rosa felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she'd had as a young woman staring at her first programming assignment. Part terror, part excitement, and absolute certainty that she could figure it out if someone would just give her the chance. She knew she should mind her own business, keep pushing her cart, keep her head down, keep being invisible. That was the safe choice, the smart choice. But as Mark caught her eye through the chaos, his expression a mixture of desperation and hope, Rosa realized that sometimes the smart choice wasn't the right choice. Sometimes you had to step out of the shadows and remind the world who you really were. The morning sun climbed higher outside Valente Technologies' windows, but inside the building, darkness seemed to be falling. Rosa continued her routine, emptying wastebaskets, restocking supplies, pretending not to notice the growing desperation around her. But her mind kept circling back to the technical fragments she'd overheard. By 8 a.m., the situation had deteriorated further. The IT team had called in external consultants, men in expensive suits who spoke in clipped, authoritative tones about unprecedented breaches and sophisticated attack vectors. Rosa paused her work near the conference room, ostensibly cleaning, a water stain from the glass wall while she listened. "It's not just encrypted," one of the consultants was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "The code is adaptive. Every time we try to break through one layer, it generates 3 more. I've never seen anything like it." The lead IT specialist, a man named David Rodriguez, whom Rosa had seen around the building for years, ran his hands through his hair. "We've tried everything in our playbook. Rollback protocols, emergency overrides, even contacting the software vendors. Nothing's working." "How long before we lose the client?" someone asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. Rosa felt something twist in her stomach. She'd watched this company grow over the past 20 years, had seen it weather other storms and emerge stronger. The employees here weren't just faces to her. They were people with families, mortgages, dreams that depended on their paychecks. Mark had a wedding to pay for next spring. Linda from accounting was saving for her daughter's college tuition. Even Mr. Davidson, for all his bluster, employed over 300 people who depended on Valente Technologies staying afloat. As Rosa moved to clean the water cooler near the conference room, she found herself studying the error messages flickering across the consultant's screens. Her trained eye, rusty but still sharp, began to recognize patterns in what looked like chaos to everyone else. The encryption wasn't random. It followed a logic, a signature that reminded her of something she'd seen before. 23 years ago, she thought with a start, in Professor Williams' advanced systems security class. The memory hit her like a physical blow. She'd been 27 then, a single mother juggling night classes and day jobs, determined to finish her computer engineering degree despite every obstacle life threw at her. Professor Williams had been her mentor, the one person who'd seen past her circumstances, to recognize her raw talent for understanding how systems thought, how they could be protected or exploited. He'd shown the class a theoretical attack method, something so sophisticated that most experts considered it purely academic. The recursive mirror, he'd called it, a piece of malicious code that didn't just hide, it learned, adapted, grew stronger with every attempt to remove it. Rosa's hands trembled slightly as she sprayed cleaning solution on the water cooler. If she was right, if someone had actually weaponized Professor Williams's theoretical model, then everyone in that conference room was approaching the problem from the wrong angle entirely. "Excuse me, ma'am." Rosa turned to find David Rodriguez, standing behind her, his expression polite but strained. "I'm sorry, but we need this area cleared for the morning. Confidential discussions, you understand." "Of course," Rosa said quietly, beginning to wheel her cart away. But as she moved, something inside her rebelled against the familiar dismissal. She'd spent 20 years being politely shuffled aside, treated as part of the furniture rather than a person with thoughts and knowledge worth hearing. She turned back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Rodriguez?" He looked up from his tablet, clearly impatient to get back to the crisis. "Yes?" "I couldn't help but overhear. You mentioned the code is adaptive, that it gets stronger. When you try to break it?" David's expression shifted from impatience to incredulity. "I'm sorry, but this is really not something—" "Because if it's what I think it is," Rosa continued, her voice gaining strength despite her racing pulse, "you're fighting it the wrong way. You can't break a recursive mirror through direct confrontation. You have to—" "Ma'am," David's tone had grown cold, "with all due respect, this is a highly technical situation that requires specialized expertise. I'm sure your concerns are well-intentioned, but—" "I have a degree in computer engineering," Rosa said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. David blinked, clearly caught off guard, but his expression quickly hardened into patronizing skepticism. "I'm sure you do," he said, his tone suggesting he believed nothing of the sort. "But right now, we have actual experts handling this situation, people with current certifications and experience with enterprise-level systems. I think it's best if you let us handle our jobs and you handle yours." Rosa felt the familiar sting of dismissal sharpened by 20 years of similar encounters. But underneath the hurt was something else, a quiet, burning anger that she'd kept carefully contained for decades. "Of course," she said again, her voice perfectly level. "I understand." But as she pushed her cart away from the conference room, Rosa's mind was already working. She'd been dismissed before, by professors who thought a single mother couldn't keep up, by interviewers who saw her childcare gaps as professional weaknesses, by 1,000 small moments when people had looked at her circumstances instead of her capabilities. She'd accepted those dismissals once, had let them shape her choices and limit her dreams. But watching the panic spread through Valente Technologies, knowing that hundreds of jobs hung in the balance while the experts pursued the wrong solution entirely, Rosa felt something shift inside her. Maybe it was time to stop accepting other people's limitations on who she could be. Mark appeared at her elbow as she moved toward the elevators, his face creased with worry. "Rosa, have you ever seen anything like this before? The whole building feels like it's about to collapse." Rosa looked at the young man who'd always treated her with genuine kindness, who'd never once made her feel invisible or less than. His question, she heard not dismissal but genuine curiosity, genuine respect for her observations. "I might have," she said carefully, "but I don't think anyone's ready to hear what I have to say." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" Rosa studied his face, seeing the desperation there, the willingness to consider possibilities that others might reject out of hand. For the first time in years, she felt the stirring of something dangerous. Hope. "Mark," she said quietly, "what if I told you that the people trying to fix this are going about it completely wrong? That they're actually making it worse?" "I'd say at this point we need all the help we can get," Mark replied without hesitation, "even if it comes from unexpected places." Rosa nodded slowly, her decision crystallizing. Then maybe it's time. Someone listened to the janitor. By noon, the crisis at Valente Technologies had spiraled beyond containment. Rosa watched from the break room as executives she'd never seen before, board members, she assumed, swept through the corridors in dark suits, their faces grim with the weight of impending financial disaster. The investor call had been postponed. Twice, but the clients were growing restless, and rumors of a major security breach were already starting to leak to the press. Mr. Davidson had locked himself in his office with the senior partners, their raised voices carrying through the supposedly soundproof glass. The IT consultants had multiplied like a rash, filling every available conference room with their equipment and confident theories. But Rosa could see the growing panic behind their professional facades. She'd tried to approach David Rodriguez. twice more during the morning, offering oblique suggestions that might help him recognize what they were really dealing with. Each time, he'd dismissed her more curtly than the last, his patience clearly frayed by stress and mounting pressure from above. "Ma'am, please," he'd said during their latest encounter near the copy machine, "I appreciate your interest, but you need to understand that we're dealing with a sophisticated cyber attack here. This isn't something you can fix with basic computer knowledge from a community college course." The casual cruelty of his assumption that her expertise must be amateur, self-taught, somehow less valid than his expensive certifications, had stung more than Rosa cared to admit. But it was the smirk he'd shared with his colleague, the eye roll when he thought she wasn't looking, that finally ignited something dangerous in her chest. She was cleaning the executive washroom when she overheard the call that changed everything. Mr. Davidson's voice carried through the thin walls, sharp with barely controlled panic. "I don't care what it takes. If we can't restore the system by 3 p.m., we're looking at a complete loss of client confidence. Stock prices, market share, everything we've built over 20 years, gone." Rosa paused in her work, her cloth still in her hand. "The board is already asking questions about my competence," Davidson continued. "If this gets out to the media before we fix it, I'm done. We're all done." There was a long pause, then, "No, I understand the risks, but at this point, we're looking at bankruptcy anyway. Do whatever you have to do. Wipe the servers clean if necessary. We'll rebuild from backups even if it takes months. Better than complete corporate death." Rosa's blood went cold. Wiping the servers wouldn't just eliminate the malicious code, it would destroy everything. Customer data, proprietary research, financial records, employee information, everything that made Valente Technologies what it was would disappear in an instant. And the backups? Rosa had been cleaning the server room for 20 years. She'd watched the IT staff grow complacent about backup protocols, had seen the accumulating dust on backup drives that hadn't been tested in months. If they were planning to rebuild from those corrupted, outdated files, they'd be setting the company up for an even worse disaster down the line. She thought about Mark, about Linda from accounting, about the hundreds of employees who had no idea their livelihoods were about to be erased by their own leadership's panic. She thought about the elegant solution she could see so clearly in her mind, the one nobody would let her explain because she was just the janitor. Rosa set down her cleaning supplies and walked out of the washroom with purpose for the first time in years. She found Mark in the break room, slumped over a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his tie loosened, his hair sticking up from repeated runs of his fingers. "Mark," she said, settling into the chair across from him, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." He looked up, and she saw in his eyes the same desperation she'd felt 23 years ago when her son was sick, and she couldn't afford the doctor bills, when every door seemed closed and every expert told her there was nothing to be done. "They're going to wipe the servers," she said without preamble. Mark's face went white. "What? That's corporate suicide. We'd lose everything." "I know, and it won't even solve the problem because they don't understand what they're fighting." Rosa leaned forward, her voice urgent but steady. "Mark, I need you to trust me. Really trust me, not just be polite to the nice janitor. Can you do that?" Something in her tone made him straighten, made him really look at her for perhaps the first time in all their brief interactions. "Rosa, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that I've been watching them attack this problem from the wrong angle all morning. They're treating it like a standard breach, but it's not. It's something much more sophisticated, something I learned about in school 25 years ago but never thought I'd see in the wild." "In school?" Mark's voice was carefully neutral, but she could see him processing, trying to reconcile this conversation with his assumptions about who she was. "Computer engineering, State University," Rosa said simply. "Specialized in system security, top of my class until—" She gestured vaguely at herself, at the uniform that had defined her for so long. "Life happened?" Mark stared at her for a long moment. "You're serious?" "Dead serious, and if they wipe those servers, they'll destroy the company, and still—" not solve the underlying problem. The attack will just migrate to whatever system they rebuild, probably stronger than before. But David and his team? David and his team are brilliant at fixing normal problems, Rosa interrupted. But this isn't normal. This is a recursive mirror attack, something so theoretical that most cybersecurity experts think it's impossible to implement. They're trying to fight it like a conventional virus, which is exactly what makes it stronger. Mark was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly racing. Finally, he asked, "If you know what it is, can you stop it?" Rosa felt the weight of the question settle on her shoulders. 20 years of invisible competence had led to this moment, a chance to step out of the shadows and prove that expertise didn't always come in the package people expected. "I think so," she said, "but I'd need access to the system, and I'd need someone to convince them to let me try." "They'll never listen," Mark said, but his voice carried a note of hope she hadn't heard from him all day. "They will if they're desperate enough," Rosa replied. "And from what I overheard, they're getting there fast." Mark stood up abruptly, his decision made. "Come on." "Where are we going?" "To save this company," Mark said, his voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. "And to show everyone what happens when you actually listen to the smartest person in the room." Rosa felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth, the first genuine smile she'd worn in years. After 2 decades of being invisible, she was finally ready to be seen. Mark led Rosa through the corridors with new purpose, but their first stop wasn't the executive floor. It was the basement server room that Rosa knew better than anyone else in the building. Her master key, earned through 20 years of trusted service, opened doors that most employees had never seen. "I need to show you something," Rosa said as they descended the stairs. "Something that might explain why this attack was so effective." The server room hummed with the constant white noise of cooling fans and processing power. Rosa had cleaned this space thousands of times, had watched it evolve from a simple closet of desktop computers to the sophisticated nerve center that now powered all of Valente Technologies' operations. But more importantly, she'd observed things that the IT staff had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. "Look at this," Rosa said, pointing to a bank of backup drives in the corner. The devices were covered in a fine layer of dust, their status lights dark. "When was the last time anyone tested these backups?" Mark peered at the equipment, his expression growing troubled. I don't know. That's not really my area." Rosa pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight, illuminating serial numbers and maintenance tags on the backup drives. "According to these service stickers, they haven't been tested in over 8 months. And this drive here?" She pointed to one unit that looked newer than the others. "Its connection cable is loose. Has been for weeks, probably. I noticed it while cleaning, but assumed IT would spot it during their regular maintenance." "Oh God," Mark whispered. "If they wipe the main servers and try to restore from these..." "They'll get corrupted data at best, nothing at worst," Rosa finished. "The company won't just lose its current operations, it'll lose its entire digital history." She moved deeper into the server room, her trained eye cataloging details that months of careful observation had burned into her memory. "There's more. See this network junction here? It's been jury-rigged with older equipment that doesn't match the security protocols for the main system. Someone saved money by using legacy hardware, but it created vulnerabilities." Mark followed her around the room as Rosa pointed out a dozen small compromises, shortcuts, and maintenance failures that individually seemed minor but collectively painted a picture of a system far more fragile than anyone realized. "How do you know all this?" Mark asked, his voice filled with growing respect. "Because I've been down here twice a week for 20 years, Rosa said simply. "And because I still think like an engineer, even when I'm pushing a mop." She led him to a workstation in the corner, a diagnostic computer that IT used for system monitoring. Rosa's fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling up network logs and system reports that most people would find incomprehensible. "Look at this traffic pattern," she said, pointing to a series of data spikes on the screen. "The attack didn't start this morning. It's been building for weeks, maybe months. Small intrusions, gathering information, learning the system's defensive patterns. Mark leaned over her shoulder, trying to make sense of the scrolling data. You can see all that from these logs? Computer systems talk if you know how to listen, Rosa replied. And this one's been screaming for help for a long time. The attack this morning wasn't the beginning. It was the finale of a very long, very patient campaign. She pulled up another screen, showing the real-time status of the company's main servers. The data told a story of digital warfare, with the mysterious attack code continuing to strengthen its grip on Valente's systems, while the IT team's increasingly desperate countermeasures only made things worse. There, Rosa said, pointing to a specific data stream. That's the signature I was looking for. The way the code responds to intrusion attempts, the mathematical pattern of its defensive adaptation. It's definitely a recursive mirror attack, but it's been modified. Modified how? Rosa was quiet for a moment, her mind working through possibilities she wished she didn't have to consider. Someone took the theoretical framework and made it practical. More aggressive, more adaptive than anything Professor Williams ever imagined. This isn't just academic anymore, it's weaponized. Mark's phone buzzed with an urgent text. His face paled as he read it. Rosa, they're moving up the timeline. Davidson just gave the order to begin server wipes in 30 minutes. 30 minutes? Rosa felt a surge of adrenaline. That's not enough time to— It has to be, Mark interrupted. Because if we don't stop this now, there won't be a company left to save. Rosa stared at the diagnostic screen, weighing her options. She could see the solution clearly in her mind, a precise sequence of commands that would essentially turn the attack code's adaptive nature against itself, causing it to consume its own defenses until it collapsed. But executing that solution would require access to the main system, administrative privileges she didn't have, and most critically, the trust of people who had spent all morning dismissing her expertise. "Mark," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "I need you to get me into that conference room, not as the janitor asking permission, but as a consultant with a legitimate solution to their problem." "How?" Rosa smiled, and for the first time in years, it wasn't the humble, self-deprecating smile she'd perfected for navigating invisible spaces. It was the confident expression of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "By making them desperate enough to listen to anyone," she said. "Even me." She pulled out her master key and moved to a secured cabinet that housed the building's central network hub. "I'm going to temporarily isolate their current repair attempts from the main system. It won't hurt anything, but it will make their efforts completely ineffective for the next 15 minutes. "Is that ethical?" Mark asked, though his tone suggested. He already knew the answer. "Is it ethical to let them destroy the company because they're too proud to listen to the right solution?" Rosa countered. "Sometimes you have to break a few rules to save everything that matters." She made the necessary adjustments, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. Within minutes, the diagnostic screens showed the IT team's repair efforts grinding to a halt, their access to the infected systems completely blocked. "That should get their attention," Rosa said, closing the cabinet and straightening her uniform. "Now we go upstairs and give them an offer they can't refuse." As they headed back toward the elevators, Mark turned to her with an expression of amazed respect. "Rosa, who are you really?" Rosa thought about the question as they rode up toward the executive floor, toward a confrontation that would either save her career or end it permanently. Who was she? The invisible janitor who'd spent 20 years in the background? The brilliant engineer who'd been forced to abandon her dreams? The mother who'd sacrificed everything for her son's future? Maybe she was all of those things. Maybe that's what had always made her uniquely qualified for this moment. "I'm the person who's going to save this company," she said as the elevator doors opened, "whether they want me to or not." The scene in the main conference room was barely controlled chaos when Rosa and Mark arrived. David Rodriguez stood at the head of the table, his expensive shirt wrinkled and sweat-stained, gesticulating frantically at a wall of monitors that showed nothing but error messages and system failures. The external consultants clustered around their laptops like field surgeons trying to save a dying patient, their earlier confidence replaced by grim determination. Mr. Davidson paced behind them all, his phone pressed to his ear as he delivered. Increasingly desperate explanations to what Rosa assumed were board members or major clients. The words she caught: temporary setback, sophisticated attack, full restoration imminent, painted a picture of a man watching his life's work crumble in real time. "What do you mean, complete system lockout?" David was saying to one of his technicians. "We had access 5 minutes ago." Rosa felt a small pang of guilt about her interference downstairs, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the urgency of the situation. She'd given herself 15 minutes of system isolation to make her case. After that, the automated protocols would restore normal access, and the IT team would resume their well-intentioned, but ultimately destructive, repair attempts. "Excuse me," Mark said, stepping into the room with Rosa close behind. "I think we might have a solution." The room fell silent. David looked up from his screens, his expression cycling through confusion, irritation, and recognition as he spotted Rosa in her cleaning uniform. "Mark, this really isn't the time," David said, his voice tight with stress. "We're dealing with a complete system failure here, and—" "That's exactly why you need to listen," Mark interrupted, his voice carrying an authority Rosa had never heard from him before. "Rosa has identified what type of attack you're dealing with and why your current approach isn't working." "Rosa," Mr. Davidson paused his pacing, his phone lowering slightly. "The janitor?" The room's atmosphere shifted perceptibly, a mixture of incredulity and desperate hope, creating an almost electric tension. Rosa felt every eye in the room focus on her, some curious, some skeptical, some openly dismissive. "Sir," Rosa said, stepping forward with a calm she didn't entirely feel, "with respect, I'm not just a janitor. I have a degree in computer engineering from State University, and I've been observing this system's vulnerabilities for 20 years. What you're dealing with isn't a standard cyber attack. It's a recursive mirror intrusion, and every attempt to break it conventionally is making it stronger." David laughed, a sharp, stressed sound with no humor in it. "A recursive mirror? That's theoretical computer science fiction. It doesn't exist in the real world." "It does now," Rosa said firmly. She moved to the nearest monitor, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "May I?" "Absolutely not." David stepped between her and the computer. "Ma'am, I don't know where you picked up these terms, but you cannot just—" "David!" Mr. Davidson's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Step aside." "Sir, you can't be serious. She's a cleaning lady with no current certifications, no security clearance, no. She's someone with a fresh perspective, which is more than I can say for the team of experts who've been making this problem worse for the past 6 hours," Davidson replied coldly. "At this point, I'm willing to listen to anyone who has a different approach." Rosa felt the weight of the moment as she approached the computer. Every person in the room was watching her, their careers and livelihoods hanging in the balance. But instead of fear, she felt a familiar calm descending, the same focused tranquility she'd experienced decades ago when debugging seemed impossible, until suddenly it wasn't. She pulled up the system diagnostics, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the keyboard. The room remained silent except for the soft clicking of keys and the hum of overtaxed servers. "Look at this pattern," Rosa said, highlighting a series of data flows on the main screen. "Your attack code isn't just defending itself, it's learning from every repair attempt you make. Each time you try to break through its encryption, it creates new layers of protection based on your methodology." She pulled up another window showing the progression of the attack over the past several hours. "Here at 9:47 a.m. you attempted a standard rollback protocol. The system immediately created 3 new defensive subroutines. At 10:23 you tried to isolate the infected files, and it responded by spreading to previously clean sectors." One of the external consultants leaned forward, his skepticism beginning to give way to professional interest. "How is that possible? Code can't actually think." "It can't think, but it can adapt," Rosa replied. "The recursive mirror technique uses machine learning algorithms to analyze intrusion patterns and evolve countermeasures in real time. The more sophisticated your attacks, the more sophisticated its defenses become. She turned to face the room, her confidence growing with each word. You've been fighting this like it's a static problem, but it's actually a dynamic opponent. Every minute you spend trying to overpower it, it gets stronger. David was studying the screen now, his expression troubled. If that's true, then what's the solution? We can't just leave it alone. You don't fight it, Rosa said. You trick it. She pulled up a command prompt, her fingers pausing over the keyboard as she felt the weight of 20 years of suppressed expertise flowing back into her hands. The system's adaptive algorithms are designed to respond to threats by becoming more complex, but complexity creates vulnerabilities. If we feed it a very specific sequence of false intrusion attempts, ones designed to trigger recursive loops in its own defensive code, we can make it consume itself. The room was completely silent now. Every expert in the space focused on Rosa's explanation with laser intensity. It's like a snake eating its own tail, she continued. The system becomes so focused on defending against phantom threats that it doesn't notice us quietly dismantling its actual attack protocols from the inside. Mr. Davidson stepped closer, his phone finally forgotten. How long would this take? If I'm right about the underlying architecture, about 15 minutes, Rosa said. But there's a risk. If I'm wrong, or if the attack code has been modified. Beyond what I'm assuming, I could trigger a complete system meltdown that would make your planned server wipe look like a minor inconvenience. The silence that followed was deafening. Rosa could see the calculations happening behind Mr. Davidson's eyes, the risk of trusting an untested theory from an unexpected source versus the certainty of corporate destruction if they continued on their current path. What do you need? He asked finally. Administrative access to the main system, Rosa replied, and 15 minutes without interference from any other repair attempts. David started to protest, but Mr. Davidson raised a hand to silence him. Done. Mark, clear everyone else out of the system. Rosa gets complete access. Sir, this is incredibly risky, David said. If she's wrong, we're no worse off than we are now, Davidson interrupted. And if she's right, she'll have saved this company. He turned to Rosa, his expression intense. No pressure. Rosa smiled. A real smile. Confident and calm. I've been preparing for this moment for 20 years, she said. I'm ready. As she settled into the chair at the main workstation, Rosa felt the last of her invisibility fall away. For the first time since she was 27 years old, she was exactly where she belonged, solving the impossible problem that no one else could see. The conference room fell into tense silence as Rosa's fingers began moving across the keyboard with increasing speed and precision. On the wall monitors, lines of code scrolled past in streams of green text that looked like digital rain to most observers, but Rosa read them as easily as sheet music. First step, she said, her voice steady and professional. I'm going to create a series of false intrusion signatures that will trigger the system's adaptive responses without actually threatening its core functions. David Rodriguez watched over her shoulder, his skepticism warring with growing fascination as Rosa navigated through system architectures with the fluency of a native speaker. Those access protocols, how do you know those commands? Because I helped design similar systems in graduate school, Rosa replied without looking up from her work. Before I became invisible to people like you. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. David's face flushed, but before he could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the building. The main screen flashed red with warnings. System integrity. Compromised. Critical failure imminent. What did you do? One of the external consultants shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Exactly what I said I would do, Rosa replied calmly, her fingers continuing their dance across the keyboard. The attack code is responding to my false intrusions by creating more defensive layers. In about 30 seconds, it's going to realize. It's been tricked, and that's when the real work begins. Mr. Davidson moved closer, his face pale but determined. Rosa, if this goes wrong... It won't, she said, and something in her voice made everyone in the room believe her. Trust me. The system warnings intensified, cascading across every screen in the room. To the untrained eye, it looked like complete digital chaos. But Rosa saw the pattern emerging, the recursive loops she'd been waiting for beginning to form in the attack code's defensive algorithms. "There," she said, highlighting a section of rapidly scrolling code. "The system is trying to defend against 17 different phantom intrusions simultaneously. It's using up enormous processing power, creating countermeasures for threats that don't actually exist." She opened a new command window, her fingers moving with surgical precision as she began typing commands that would have been gibberish to most people in the room. But David, despite his earlier dismissal, was following her logic with growing amazement. "You're using the system's own adaptive mechanisms against it," he said, his voice filled with reluctant admiration, "creating feedback loops in its defensive programming." "The digital equivalent of getting someone to chase their own tail," Rosa confirmed. "But the timing has to be perfect. Too early, and it recovers. Too late, and it adapts beyond what we can counter." The tension in the room was palpable as Rosa worked. Mark stood near the door, his face tight with anxiety as he watched his faith in Rosa play out in real time. The external consultants clustered around their own equipment, trying to understand what was happening on a technical level. "System load approaching critical levels," one of them reported. "We're at 97% capacity." "Good," Rosa said. "That means it's working." But just as she spoke, something unexpected happened. The scrolling code on the main screen suddenly changed pattern, shifting from the predictable recursive loops Rosa had been counting on to something far more chaotic and aggressive. "Oh no," she whispered, her fingers freezing over the keyboard. "What?" Mr. Davidson demanded. "What's happening?" Rosa stared at the screen, her mind racing through possibilities she hadn't considered. Someone modified the attack code beyond the standard recursive mirror architecture. It's not just adaptive, it's learning to recognize when it's being manipulated. The system warnings reached a crescendo, and suddenly every screen in the room went black, complete silence. Then David's voice, tight with barely controlled panic. "Did we just lose everything?" Rosa's hands remained poised over the keyboard, her mind working through the implications of what had just happened. In the darkness of the dead screens, she could feel the weight of 300 jobs, 20 years of company history, and her own credibility hanging in the balance. "Rosa?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper. She took a deep breath, her fingers finding the keyboard in the darkness. "I need emergency lighting and a direct connection to the server room. Now." "But the screens? The screens are just the interface," Rosa said, her voice carrying a new urgency. "The real battle is happening in the server room, and I need to see what's actually going on down there." As emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the conference room, Rosa stood and faced the assembled group. Her cleaning uniform seemed almost ceremonial now, a reminder of the journey that had brought her to this moment. "I need to go downstairs," she said. "The attack code has triggered a defensive shutdown, but it's not over. I can still stop this, but I have to do it from the source." David stepped forward, his earlier antagonism replaced by desperate hope. "What do you need from us?" "Time," Rosa said, "and the courage to trust someone you've spent all morning underestimating." As she headed for the door, Mr. Davidson called after her. "Rosa, if you can fix this, when you fix this, we need to talk about your future here." Rosa paused at the threshold, looking back at the room full of experts who had finally begun to see her for who she really was. "Mr. Davidson, after today, I think my future is going to look very different than any of us expected." Then she was gone, heading for the server room and the final confrontation with the digital demon that had brought Valente Technologies to its knees. The server room felt different now, charged with electricity and possibility as Rosa descended. Into the heart of Valente Technologies' digital nervous system, the emergency lighting cast long shadows between the humming towers of equipment, and Rosa could hear the subtle changes in the machine's rhythms that told her the attack code was still active, still fighting. Mark followed her down, along with David Rodriguez, who had overcome his pride enough to admit he needed to see how this ended. The three of them stood in the flickering light, surrounded by millions of dollars of equipment that had been reduced to very expensive paperweights by a few thousand lines of malicious code. "The main terminals are still dead," David said, checking his tablet. "Complete system lockout." Rosa moved to the diagnostic workstation she'd used earlier, her fingers finding the manual override switches that most people forgot existed. "The attack code thinks it's won," she said, powering up the station with analog controls that bypassed the digital lockout. But it made a mistake. When it triggered the defensive shutdown, it revealed its true architecture. The diagnostic screen flickered to life, showing the raw data streams that represented the ongoing battle between the attack code and the system's basic functions. Rosa studied the patterns, her mind processing information that looked like chaos to everyone else. "There," she said, pointing to a specific data signature. "The code isn't just mimicking a recursive mirror attack, it's a hybrid. Someone combined it with elements of a logic bomb and a worm protocol. That's why it was so aggressive when it detected my manipulation attempts." "Can you still stop it?" Mark asked, his voice tight with worry. Rosa was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing pathways through the diagnostic interface. "I can, but it's going to require something I haven't done in 23 years. "What?" "I'm going to have to write new code, in real time, while the attack is actively fighting back. It's like performing surgery on a patient who's trying to punch you." She pulled up a command interface that looked like it belonged in a museum compared to the sleek modern systems upstairs, but Rosa's hands moved across the ancient keyboard with the confidence of someone returning to a familiar instrument after years away. "I'm going to create a counter-program," she explained as she worked. "Not something that fights the attack code directly, but something that offers it a more attractive target, like putting out a decoy for a predator." Her fingers flew across the keys, writing elegant lines of code that danced between the established protocols of the system and the chaotic intrusions of the attack program. David watched over her shoulder, his admiration growing with each perfectly structured command. "You're not just stopping the attack," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "You're teaching the system how to defend itself." "That's the only way to guarantee this doesn't happen again," Rosa replied. "Once the system learns to recognize this type of hybrid attack, it'll be immune to similar intrusions." The diagnostic screen began showing changes, subtle at first, then more dramatic as Rosa's counter-program took hold. The chaotic data streams started organizing themselves into recognizable patterns, and the system's vital signs began stabilizing. "It's working," Mark breathed, watching the screens transform from red warnings to amber cautionaries to green confirmations. But Rosa wasn't finished. With the attack code neutralized, she turned her attention to the deeper vulnerabilities she'd identified earlier. The loose connections, the outdated protocols, the security gaps that had made the intrusion possible in the first place. "What are you doing now?" David asked. "Fixing 20 years of deferred maintenance," Rosa said, her voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and determination. "Making sure this never happens again." She worked for another 20 minutes, her hands moving with the unconscious grace of someone performing a task she'd been born to do. When she finally leaned back from the keyboard, the diagnostic screens showed a picture of digital health that was better than anything Valente Technologies had achieved in years. "System integrity at 99.7%, she announced. "All critical functions restored. Security protocols upgraded, and I've built in adaptive defenses that will evolve with any future threats." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of phones ringing upstairs, the first sign that the outside world was recognizing that Valente Technologies was back online. David stared at the screens, then at Rosa, his expression a mixture of awe and shame. "Rosa, I owe you an apology. I judged you based on your job title instead of your capabilities. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." Rosa nodded, accepting his apology with grace. "I'm used to being underestimated, David, but I'm not used to being given the chance to prove people wrong. Thank you for that." As they prepared to return upstairs, Rosa took one last look around the server room that had been her second home for so many years. Tomorrow, she realized, she would probably never clean this room again. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like liberation. "Rosa," Mark said as they reached the elevator, "how does it feel to save the company?" Rosa considered the question as the elevator climbed toward the executive floor, toward a future she couldn't have imagined that morning. "It feels like coming home," she said finally, "like remembering who I really am." The elevator doors opened onto chaos, but this time it was the organized chaos of a company springing back to life. Phones were ringing, computers were humming, and the crisis that had threatened to destroy everything had been transformed into the foundation for something stronger. As Rosa stepped out of the elevator, no longer invisible, no longer just the janitor, she felt the weight of 20 years of hidden potential finally lifting from her shoulders. 3 months later, Rosa Martinez sat in her new office on the 26th floor of Valente Technologies, reviewing security protocols for the company's expanded client base. The view from her window showed the same city she'd gazed at from the break room, but everything looked different now, brighter, more full of possibility. The nameplate on her door read, "Rosa Martinez, Chief Information Security Officer," and every time she saw it, she felt a small thrill of pride. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Some employees had struggled to accept her rapid promotion, from janitor to executive, and she'd had to prove herself again and again in meetings where her technical expertise was quietly questioned. But she'd persevered, just as she had 20 years ago when she'd first pushed a mop through these same hallways. The difference was that now she didn't have to hide who she was or apologize for what she knew. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Mark entered carrying a tablet and wearing the confident smile that had become his trademark since his promotion to Assistant Director of Operations. "Rosa, I've got the quarterly security report. We're showing a 97% improvement in threat detection and response time since the new protocols went live." Rosa smiled, taking the tablet and scanning the numbers that represented her systematic overhaul of the company's entire digital infrastructure. "Any major incidents?" 3 attempted intrusions, all stopped automatically by the adaptive defense systems you designed. The attackers never got past the first layer of protection. "Good." Rosa leaned back in her chair, remembering the terror of that day when everything had hung in the balance. "How's David adjusting to the new security requirements?" Mark grinned. "He's actually become one of your biggest advocates. He's been telling everyone who'll listen that hiring you was the smartest decision the company ever made." "That's generous of him." "It's also true." Mark's expression grew more serious. "Rosa, I've been thinking about what happened that day, about how close we came to losing everything, because people couldn't see past your uniform to recognize your expertise." Rosa nodded, understanding where he was going. "It's something I think about too. How many other people are out there, hidden in plain sight, with talents that nobody's bothering to notice? Which is why I wanted to talk to you about an idea I've been developing." Mark pulled up a presentation on his tablet. "What if we created a program, something that looks for untapped potential in unexpected places, not just here at Valente, but throughout the industry?" Rosa studied the preliminary proposal, her interest growing with each slide. "You're talking about a systematic approach to identifying overlooked talent?" "Exactly. Skills-based assessment regardless of educational background or current job title. We could partner with community colleges, job training programs, even reach out to people who've been out of the workforce for years." The idea resonated deeply with Rosa. She thought about her own journey, about the decades she'd spent believing that her dreams were impossible simply because life had taken her down a different path. How many other people were out there, convinced they'd missed their chance to contribute something meaningful? "I love it," she said finally. "But it would need to be more than just a recruitment program. We'd need mentorship, flexible scheduling for people with family obligations, pathways for advancement that don't require traditional credentials." "Exactly." Mark's enthusiasm was infectious. "We could call it the Hidden Potential Initiative, A way to find the Rosa Martinezes of the world before they spend 20 years being invisible. Rosa felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced that morning when she'd first realized she could solve the company's crisis. It was the feeling of possibility, of being able to make a difference that extended far beyond her own circumstances. "Let's do it," she said. "But I want to make sure we're not just looking for technical talent. There are people with hidden gifts in accounting, marketing, customer service. Every department has potential that's being overlooked." As they discussed the details of the program, Rosa's mind wandered to her son, who was now finishing his master's degree in engineering. When she'd called him that first day to tell him about her promotion, he'd been silent for a long moment before saying, "Mom, I always knew you were brilliant. I'm just glad the rest of the world is finally catching up." That conversation had meant more to her than any professional recognition or salary increase. For years, she'd worried that her son had seen her as someone who'd given up on her dreams, someone who'd settled for less than she deserved. Now she realized that he'd always seen her as someone who'd made sacrifices for the people she loved, someone who'd never stopped being the brilliant woman who'd raised him. "Rosa?" Mark's voice brought her back to the present. "You okay?" "Just thinking about how much has changed," she said. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in an executive office, designing programs to help other people achieve their potential, I would have thought they were crazy. And now? Rosa looked around her office, at the diplomas on the wall that she'd finally felt confident enough to display, at the awards from professional organizations that had recognized her contributions to cybersecurity, but what she saw most clearly was the future, not just her own, but the futures of all the people whose hidden potential was waiting to be discovered. Now, I think the crazy thing would be to not use this opportunity to change as many lives as possible, she said. As Mark left to begin working on the proposal, Rosa turned back to her computer and pulled up the company directory. 347 employees, each with their own story, their own hidden talents and overlooked capabilities. Tomorrow, she'd start looking at them with new eyes, searching for the next person who might be waiting for someone to see past their job title to recognize their true potential. She thought about the cleaning cart she'd pushed through these halls for 20 years, about the invisible woman who'd learned to navigate the world by staying in the background. That woman had been real, had been valuable, had been worthy of respect regardless of her job title. But she'd also been incomplete, a fraction of what Rosa Martinez was capable of becoming. Now, as she prepared to leave the office and head home to her small apartment that would soon be replaced by something that reflected her new circumstances, Rosa felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for the opportunity she'd been given, but for the 20 years of preparation that had made her ready to seize it. The building was quieter now, most employees having gone home for the evening. As Rosa walked through the hallways toward the parking garage, she passed the night cleaning crew beginning their shift. She recognized some of them from her years of early morning arrivals, and she made a mental note to add them to the list of people she wanted to talk to about the Hidden Potential Initiative. Because if there was one thing Rosa had learned from her journey from invisibility to influence, it was that extraordinary people could be found in the most ordinary places. You just had to know how to look for them. As she drove home through the city streets, Rosa Martinez smiled at the reflection she glimpsed in her rearview mirror. It was the face of someone who had spent 20 years preparing for a moment she didn't know was coming, someone who had refused to let circumstances define her possibilities. It was the face of someone who had learned that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. This story is a reminder that expertise and potential exist in every workplace, often hidden behind job titles and assumptions. Rosa Martinez represents the countless individuals whose talents go unrecognized, not because they lack ability, but because others fail to see beyond the surface. Sometimes the most qualified person to solve your problem is the one you've been overlooking every day. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.